What if the most dangerous thing in the galaxy wasn't a weapon at all, but a species that simply would not stop fighting, no matter how many times it was knocked down? Commander VDH was about to learn that lesson with her dying breath, and her final words would haunt the Galactic Coalition for the rest of its existence. Her ship, the Dravak alone, was breaking apart around her. Sparks rained from a shattered ceiling panel. Half her bridge crew were dead or dying, their alien blood pooling in zero-gravity globules that drifted past her face like grim, glittering stars. Outside the viewport, 3 human fighter craft, crude, blocky things that should never have been able to outmaneuver Coalition starfighters, were finishing off the last of her escort. VTH keyed the emergency beacon with trembling claws. This transmission needed to reach the Coalition Council before her ship's reactor went critical, before she died, before the truth died with her. "This is Commander VDH of the 3rd Exploratory Fleet," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "I am recording this to the Council. For every species that values its survival, do not provoke the species designated Terran. Do not engage them. Do not even let them know you exist. If you can help it." She had arrived at the system called Sol 3 months earlier with 400 soldiers, expecting to find a primitive species ripe for cataloging, perhaps for quiet, controlled study, the way the Coalition had handled a dozen pre-spaceflight worlds before. Instead, she found prisoners. Hundreds of humans, abducted over decades by rogue Coalition factions running illegal experiments, kept in research facilities scattered across 3 moons. When her fleet had moved to secure the facilities, to erase the evidence, as she'd been ordered, the prisoners had done something no captured species in Coalition history had ever done. They fought back. They had no weapons, VDH continued, her breath shallow now as smoke filled the cabin. No ships, no technology beyond what they stripped from our own dead, and they took my entire ground complement apart in 11 days. She paused, replaying the memories that would not let her go. Humans rigging explosive traps from salvaged power cells. Humans coordinating ambushes with nothing but hand signals and absolute trust in each other. Humans who kept fighting even after watching their own die in agony, even when surrender would have been the rational choice. "They do not surrender," she said. "I watched starving humans, wounded humans, humans who had every logical reason to give up, choose to fight instead. And when they finally captured one of our shuttles and turned our own weapons against us, they did not show mercy. Because we had shown them none, they learned warfare from us, weaponized our cruelty, and turned it back on us tenfold." Her sensors chimed a final warning. Hull integrity failing. Reactor breach in 90 seconds. Species threat assessment must be revised immediately, she said, the words coming faster now. Terrans do not need superior technology to win. They adapt to anything you throw at them, faster than any civilization I have encountered in 30 years of service. They turn captivity into a classroom. They turn grief into strategy. They turn loss into resolve. She closed her eyes. "Whatever you do, whatever the Council decides, do not give them a reason to come looking for the rest of us." The transmission cut out in a burst of static as the Dravak's Talon tore itself apart in a silent flash of light, scattering wreckage across the cold dark beyond Neptune's orbit. 300 light-years away, in the marble halls of the Coalition Council chamber, VTH's recording played to a room full of skeptical faces. Admiral Thrak of the Kethari battle fleet listened with his arms crossed, unimpressed. "A dying commander's panic," he said when the recording ended. "She lost a third-rate expeditionary force to an uprising and dressed it up as an existential warning to save her reputation. Except she's dead, so I suppose she succeeded in something." Counselor Yeshan, an elder of the insect-like Voss Collective, tilted her segmented head. Her tactical assessments were never wrong in 30 years of service. Admiral. That is precisely why she was sent to Sol in the first place. "Then it's even more reason to finish what she failed to," Thrak said. "If this species truly poses a threat, the correct response isn't caution. It's overwhelming, decisive force, applied before they can grow stronger. We end this while it is still small." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Thrak had built his 30-year career on exactly this doctrine. Strike first, strike hard, leave no opponent capable of becoming a future problem. It had worked against the Drellner Confederacy. It had worked against the Mox hive swarm. There was no reason, in his mind, that it would not work against a species that didn't even possess interstellar travel of its own. "I will lead the response personally," Thrak announced. "Grant me the second and fourth armadas, and I will have Sol surface glass within a month, or I will bring you the head of whoever leads them." The council voted. The motion passed almost unanimously. Only Counselor Yesen abstained, her ancient compound eyes fixed on the frozen image of Commander VDH's face, forever caught mid-warning, forever unheard. What none of them yet understood, what Admiral Thrak would only discover when it was far too late to matter, was that humanity had spent decades being hunted in secret, experimented on in silence, and abandoned by a galaxy that never knew they existed. They had learned to survive in the dark long before the Coalition ever showed itself in the light. And an entire armada was now flying directly into the one fight that species in the galaxy had any practice losing. The countdown to humanity's greatest test had already begun. What happens when a civilization that has never lost a war finally meets one that has never known how to stop fighting? Admiral Thrak was about to find out, and the answer would shatter everything he believed about strength, about honor, and about the species he'd been sent to destroy. The second and fourth armadas dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Sol's outer debris field with the kind of overwhelming, theatrical force meant to break enemy morale before a single shot was fired. 400 warships unfolded across the starfield like a curtain of dark iron, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built, bristling with plasma cannons and kinetic launchers calibrated to crack planetary crusts. Thrak stood on the command deck of his flagship, the Iron Verdict, watching the tactical display populate with Earth's pitiful defense grid, a scattering of orbital satellites, a handful of crewed space stations, no visible warships of any meaningful size. "This is almost an insult," his tactical officer, Rincala, muttered. "Where's the fleet that destroyed VTH's expedition?" "There wasn't one," Thrak said, allowing himself a thin smile. "VTH was killed by ground-based insurgents using salvage equipment. There is no Terran Navy. There is no Terran defense doctrine. There is just a planet full of animals who got lucky once." He gave the order to advance. What Thrak did not know, what no sensor sweep, no probe, no scrap of intelligence had told him, was that humanity had spent 11 years preparing for exactly this moment. Ever since the first wreckage of alien technology had been recovered from the Pacific Ocean floor, ever since survivors of Coalition experimentation had been smuggled home with stories that sounded like madness, every government on Earth had quietly, desperately, united around a single shared certainty. They were not alone, and whatever was out there did not have humanity's best interests in mind. Earth had not built a visible fleet, because a visible fleet was exactly what an enemy would expect, and exactly what an enemy would target first. The Coalition armada advanced through the asteroid belt, and that was when the first ships began to disappear. Not explode, not retreat, disappear. Swallowed whole by something the Coalition's sensors registered only as gravitational anomalies a half-second before contact was lost. Thrak watched in growing disbelief as the readout showed 12 ships gone in the span of 90 seconds, with no debris, no distress signal, no warning at all. "Report," he barked. "Unknown," Rincala said, her mandibles clicking in distress. "There's no weapon signature, no energy discharge. They're simply gone." It was the asteroid belt itself. Humanity had spent a decade quietly hollowing out hundreds of asteroids, fitting them with salvage and reverse-engineered alien gravitic drives, turning each one into an autonomous mind that could fold space just enough to swallow anything that passed too close, crushing it into a singularity smaller than a marble. It was crude. It was inelegant. It was also completely undetectable by Coalition sensors, which had never imagined an enemy primitive enough or desperate enough to weaponize physics itself rather than build better guns. Thrak ordered the fleet to scatter formation and push through at full burn, abandoning caution for speed. It was a correct tactical decision against a conventional ambush. It walked them directly into the second trap. As the scattered Coalition ships emerged from the belt, automated rail platforms hidden along the asteroid trailing debris opened fire. Not with energy weapons the Coalition's shields were designed to deflect, but with solid tungsten slugs accelerated to a meaningful fraction of light speed. Crude, ancient, even by the standards of any species with real spaceflight history, and devastatingly effective against shields calibrated entirely for plasma and particle weapons. 40 more ships were crippled or destroyed in the second wave alone. This is not a primitive species, Rincala said quietly, watching the casualty numbers climb. This is a species that has been planning for war against an enemy it has never seen, using nothing but scrap and desperation for years. Thrak said nothing. He was beginning, for the first time in his long career, to feel something unfamiliar twist in his chest. Not fear, not yet, but the first cold flicker of doubt. He pressed the attack toward Earth orbit anyway, because retreat had never once been an option he'd allowed himself to consider, and because he still believed, desperately, stubbornly, that overwhelming numbers would eventually win out over clever tricks. He had no idea that the asteroid belt had been the opening move, not the defense itself. Humanity's true preparation was still waiting for him, hidden in low orbit, in the upper atmosphere, in bunkers beneath every major capital on Earth, a defense built not around superior technology, but around the one thing the Coalition had never accounted for in any threat assessment. They had nothing left to lose, and everything left to protect. What does it look like when the most powerful armada in galactic history realizes, too late, that it walked into someone else's trap? Admiral Thrak was about to experience humanity's true defense, and would be unlike anything the Coalition had ever drawn up in a war room. By the time the remnants of the Second and Fourth Armadas reached low Earth orbit, Thrak had lost nearly a quarter of his ships to a planet that, by every Coalition metric, should not have been capable of resistance at all. He ordered an immediate orbital bombardment of what his sensors identified as humanity's largest population centers, a doctrine of total, overwhelming force meant to end the war, before it could properly begin. The order was given, the cannons charged, and every single targeting system on every remaining warship went dark at once. Report. Thrak shouted, his composure finally cracking. We've lost targeting telemetry across the fleet, Rincala said, her voice tight with disbelief. Someone is inside our network. Humanity had spent a decade studying every fragment of recovered Coalition technology with the same desperate intensity it once reserved for splitting the atom and reaching the moon, where the Coalition saw an unsophisticated species incapable of real innovation. What they had actually built, quietly, secretly, in bunkers and black sites across the planet, was an entire generation of cyber warfare specialists who understood Coalition computer architecture better than the Coalition's own engineers, because humans have been forced to reverse engineer from nothing under threat of annihilation, with no manual and no second chances. The virus had been smuggled aboard the very first Coalition ship to make contact with a captured human years earlier, dormant and waiting, designed to spread the instant any Coalition vessel linked into a shared tactical network. Exactly the kind of network an overwhelming invasion force would inevitably rely on. While Thrak's fleet scrambled to purge the intrusion, humanity's actual defense fleet finally revealed itself. They had not built warships. They had built something else entirely. Repurposed orbital construction vessels, retrofitted cargo haulers, and a scattering of genuinely advanced prototype craft built from years of painstaking reverse engineering, all of it ugly, mismatched, and held together by desperation and brilliant improvisation. What they lacked in elegance, they made up for with absolute, ruthless creativity. Mining lasers repurposed as point defense weapons. Magnetic grapples used to physically seize and disable enemy ships rather than destroy them outright, denying Thrak's fleet the dignity of even an honorable death. Suicide drones, piloted by volunteers who had lost everything to Coalition experimentation and had nothing left to fear. They're not trying to win a conventional battle, Rincala said, watching the chaos unfold across every screen. They're trying to make sure that no matter what happens to them, it costs us everything to take it. It was a kind of warfare the Coalition had no honest doctrine for, because no species in 300 years of expansion had ever fought like they had nothing left to protect except the fighting itself. Thrak watched ship after ship of his armada crippled, boarded, or torn apart. Not by superior firepower, but by an enemy who refused every single rule of engagement the Coalition had ever relied upon. They did not retreat when losses mounted. They did not sue for terms when outnumbered. They adapted in real time, broadcasting tactical updates across the human fleet in a language his translators couldn't even fully parse, learning from every single engagement and changing strategy within minutes rather than the days or weeks coalition command structures required. By the time the battle reached its 8th hour, Thrax's flagship was alone, its shields failing, its weapons offline, surrounded by the wreckage of an armada that had arrived expecting an execution and instead found a slaughter, its own. All remaining ships. Signal surrender, Thrax said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He had never spoken them before in 30 years of service. There was a long silence on the comm channel. Then a voice, human, accented, exhausted, but steady, answered in halting coalition trade tongue. Power down your weapons and your shields. Open every airlock. We're coming aboard, and you do not want to make us force the door. Thrax gave the order. As his crew complied, he found himself staring out at the wreckage of his armada drifting silently around Earth, and for the first time in his life he understood, with the cold, total clarity of absolute defeat, that Commander VDH had not been exaggerating in her final transmission. She had been understating the danger, because she had no idea, even then, just how far the species would go to protect what little they had left. Now Thrax would have to live long enough to learn why. What if everything you believed about your enemy, every justification for the war you started, turned out to be a lie built on the suffering of innocent people? Admiral Thrax was about to discover a truth that would break him far more thoroughly than any defeat in battle ever could. Thrax expected execution. He had led an unprovoked invasion fleet against a species that, by any coalition military tradition, had every right to kill him on sight and call it justice. Instead, he was brought, disarmed, restrained, but unharmed, into a converted underground facility beneath what his translators identified as the city once called Geneva. The room he was led into wasn't a cell. It was a memorial, wall after wall, floor after floor, lined with photographs and names. Thousands of them organized by date, going back nearly 4 decades. Faces of every age. Children, grandparents, soldiers and farmers and scientists and school teachers, all of them connected by a single, terrible fact stamped beneath each photograph. Taken, never returned. A woman in a simple gray uniform. No medals, no rank insignia that Thrax's translator could identify, stood waiting for him at the center of the room. She introduced herself only as Director Okafor, and her voice was quiet in a way that unsettled him far more than shouting would have. You came here to destroy us because Commander VTH told your council we were dangerous, she said. She wasn't wrong, but she never told you why we became dangerous. I think it's time you understood. She showed him everything. Decades of recovered footage and salvage data, painstakingly reconstructed from captured coalition hardware, and the broken memories of survivors who had somehow made a home. Rogue coalition research factions, operating without official sanction, but never meaningfully stopped by a council that found the data they produced too valuable to question, had been abducting humans from Earth for nearly 50 years. Testing pain thresholds. Testing adaptability under extreme stress. Testing how a species without spaceflight, without any chance of rescue or retaliation, would respond to captivity, to torture, to the systematic destruction of everything that made them who they were. They wanted to know how resilient we were. Okafor said, her composure never wavering even as the recordings played scenes that made Thrax's stomach turn. So they broke us over and over, in secret, for 50 years, and recorded every single result. Commander VTH's expedition wasn't the beginning of contact between our species, Admiral. It was the moment we finally found enough of our own people in one place to fight back. Thrax stared at the wall of faces, and something in him, something that had carried him through 30 years of confident, decisive warfare, finally cracked open. I didn't know, he said, and it sounded pathetic even as he said it. No, Okafor agreed. You didn't. Your council didn't want you to. It's much easier to send an armada against a dangerous primitive species than to admit you spent 50 years torturing innocent people and calling it research. She let that sit in the silence between them. We didn't ask for this war, Admiral. We didn't ask to become resilient. You made us this way, one abduction at a time, and now you're horrified that the thing you built refuses to lie down and die quietly the way you expected it to. Over the following weeks, under careful, watchful guard, but with a freedom of movement that surprised him, Thrax was shown more than just humanity's grief. He was shown its recovery. Hospitals rebuilding survivors who had been returned broken in body and mind. Communities had organized themselves not around vengeance, but around the desperate, defiant project of making sure no one else's family would ever go through what theirs had. Scientists working around the clock not to build weapons of conquest, but defenses meant only to ensure they would never again be taken so easily. He watched the species that had every reason become exactly as cruel as the people who had hurt them choose, again and again, not to. You could have executed every coalition prisoner you've taken, Thrak said one evening, watching human medical staff treat wounded coalition soldiers with the same care they gave their own. By any law of war I understand, you would have been justified. Maybe, Okafor said, but we decided a long time ago that we'd rather be the kind of species worth defending than the kind of species that becomes its worst enemy just to survive. She studied him for a long moment. That's the part VTH never understood, and the part one don't think your council will ever believe, either. We don't fight because we hate you, Admiral. We fight because we refuse to let anyone decide that we don't deserve to exist. For the first time since the war began, Thrak found himself wondering if the species he'd been sent to destroy might be the only one in the galaxy still worth saving, including from itself. What happens when the one man who finally understands the truth tries to stop a second war and discovers that the people in power would rather lose everything than admit they were wrong? Admiral Thrak's homecoming would test whether honesty could ever stand a chance against pride. Humanity returned Thrak to Coalition space 3 months after his capture, along with every surviving member of his armada, completely unharmed and asking for nothing in return except one thing, that he tell the Council the truth. He tried. He stood before the same marble chamber where he had once confidently demanded 2 armadas to glass a planet, and instead he laid out everything. The decades of illegal experimentation, the truth behind VDH's warning, the devastating defense Earth had built not from aggression, but from desperate necessity, the mercy humanity had shown captured coalition soldiers when cruelty would have been so much easier to justify. The silence that followed wasn't contemplation. It was disbelief curdling into anger. "You expect this council to believe," said Councillor Drenix, who had championed the invasion from its first proposal, "that an entire armada of coalition warships was defeated by farmers and schoolteachers with scrap metal and stolen software, and that the real villain in this story is us." "I expect you to believe the evidence," Thrak said. "I have brought it. Sensor logs, recovered footage, survivor testimony from our own soldiers who watched Terrans show the mercy they had no obligation to give." "Convenient," Drenix said, "that the testimony comes from soldiers who spent months as prisoners of the very species they're now defending. Have you considered, Admiral, that you may simply be compromised?" It was a familiar tactic, and Thrak recognized immediately for what it was. Not genuine skepticism, but counsel unwilling to absorb the political cost of admitting that 50 years of illegal experimentation had created the single most dangerous adversary in galactic history. Acknowledging the truth meant acknowledging responsibility. Acknowledging responsibility meant accountability. Consequences. The unraveling of careers and reputations built across centuries. It was so much simpler to call Thrak compromised, broken, sympathetic to an enemy who had clearly manipulated him during his captivity. Councillor Yesen, the only voice who had abstained from the original invasion vote, listened to every word of Thrak's testimony with her ancient compound eyes fixed unblinking on the projected evidence. "I believe him," she said quietly, when the chamber's anger finally settled enough for her voice to be heard. "I believe Commander VTH, and I believe Admiral Thrak now, and I think every member of this council who refuses to consider the possibility that we created this threat ourselves is choosing comfortable ignorance over our species' survival." She was outvoted, 312-1. The Council's official position, issued within the week, declared that the loss of the 2nd and 4th Armadas had been the result of unconventional, unethical Terran warfare tactics that violated every principle of honorable coalition engagement, and that the appropriate response was not retreat, but a larger, more thoroughly prepared retaliatory strike, one that would not underestimate the enemy's tactics a second time. Thrak argued until his voice was raw. He pointed out that more thoroughly prepared simply meant more coalition soldiers would die against a species that had already proven willing to sacrifice everything rather than surrender. He pointed out that humanity had returned every prisoner, unharmed, asking only to be left alone, and that no civilization driven purely by conquest behaved that way. It did not matter. Pride, once wounded at this scale, rarely listened to reason. The coalition had lost an armada to a species it considered beneath it, and the only acceptable outcome, in the Council's collective mind, was overwhelming victory that erased the humiliation entirely. Thrax sent a private message through smuggled channels back to Director Okafor, the only warning he could manage to slip past coalition monitoring. They are coming again, larger this time. I could not stop them. I am sorry. Her reply came back within hours, calm and unsurprised, as though she had expected this outcome from the very beginning. We know. We've known since the day you returned home. Thank you for trying anyway. We'll be ready. Thrax stood alone on the observation deck of a ship he no longer fully trusted his own people to deserve, watching the stars, and understood with a kind of hollow, exhausted clarity that it had become something neither side fully trusted anymore. A coalition officer who believed in humanity's right to exist, preparing, against every instinct he'd built across 30 years of service, to choose a side when the next war finally came. He just hoped he wouldn't be too late to matter. What happens when an entire galaxy finally learns that the most powerful weapon isn't a fleet of warships, but an idea that simply will not die no matter how many times it's attacked? The final battle for Earth was about to answer that question forever, and change the fate of every species watching. The second invasion came 2 years later, and it dwarfed the first in every measurable way. 9 armadas, over 1,000 warships, weapons specifically engineered after exhaustive study of the gravitic mines and rail platforms that had crippled Thrax's original fleet. The coalition had spent 2 years preparing for exactly the kind of unconventional warfare humanity had used against them, determined never to be humiliated the same way twice. What they had not prepared for was everyone else who showed up to fight alongside Earth. Word of humanity's stand and of the truth behind it had spread quietly across the galaxy in the 2 years since Thrax's failed warning, carried by sympathetic coalition defectors, by allied species who had their own grievances against Council overreach, by Council Yeshin's quiet, persistent efforts to make sure the full story never stayed buried. When the second armada arrived at Sol, it found Earth's defenses reinforced not just by 2 more years of human ingenuity and desperate preparation, but by ships and soldiers from a dozen species who had decided, independently, that a galaxy where the strong could torture the defenseless in secret and call it research was not a galaxy worth defending, and that humanity's stubborn, unbreakable refusal to disappear quietly was something worth standing behind. Admiral Thrax was among them, commanding a small allied contingent of coalition defectors aboard a ship that, 2 years earlier, he never would have imagined flying. The battle that followed was the largest the galaxy had seen in 3 centuries, and was fought not for territory or resources, but for a single, simple question. Did a species have a right to exist simply because it refused to stop fighting for that right? Humanity answered with everything it had built in the years since the first invasion. Defenses refined, tactics sharpened, alliances forged, and the testimony of survivors who had finally been believed. They fought alongside species who had once been their captors' allies, soldiers and engineers and ordinary volunteers standing shoulder to shoulder with creatures they would never have imagined as friends 2 years before, united by nothing more complicated than sheer refusal to let cruelty win simply because it arrived with bigger guns. When the Coalition's lead flagship finally lowered its weapons in surrender, 11 hours into battle, the silence that followed felt different from the first time. It wasn't the silence of a broken, humiliated enemy. It was the silence of an entire galaxy finally exhaling, finally allowing itself to believe that things could change. Director Okafor stood on Earth's surface, watching the wreckage of the second invasion drift harmlessly in high orbit, and gave the final transmission of the war to every channel the Allied fleet could broadcast across, coalition, ally, and undecided species alike. "You were told humanity is dangerous because we can endure anything," she said. "That's true, but it's not the whole truth. We're dangerous because no matter how much was taken from us, we never let it turn us into the thing that hurt us. We rebuilt instead of destroying. We forgave instead of executing. We protected each other instead of turning on each other, even when it would have been so much easier to give in to hatred." She paused, letting the weight of the words settle across 1,000 worlds. "An idea like that doesn't go away just because you defeat the people who believe it. It spreads. It inspires. It outlives every armada you send against it, because in the end, it was never really about us at all. In the years that followed, the Galactic Coalition restructured itself entirely. Its illegal research factions finally exposed and dismantled. Its council reshaped by species who had stood with humanity when it mattered most. Admiral Thrak, no longer an admiral of anything, just a man who had finally learned what honor actually meant, spent the rest of his life working alongside the species he had once been sent to destroy, helping rebuild what generations of secrecy and cruelty had broken. Commander VDH's final warning, once dismissed as the panic of a dying officer, became something else entirely across the galaxy in the decades that followed. Not a threat assessment, but a quiet, lasting tribute, carved into a memorial on a world she never lived to see at peace. Humanity does not survive because it is the strongest. It survives because it refuses to stop believing survival is worth fighting for. And across a galaxy slowly learning to do the same, that simple, stubborn idea kept spreading, unstoppable, unbreakable, and absolutely permanently alive.